Any other questions? So today we have two topics which may seem to be heterogeneous, relatively disconnected, but in fact are connected. One is the organization of civil society outside the state and outside the market as a domain for the development of programmatic arguments, centered on the development of the disposition to cooperate, or to use another vocabulary, the accumulation of what is sometimes called social capital, the density of the associational networks, and the level of trust in society. The second topic is education. As the clearest instance of the formation of the power of the individual to turn the tables on his context and thus to develop his power to act. So in the structure of the programmatic argument of the course, the first and most prominent theme is the democratization of the market order, especially through the dissemination of the now most advanced practice of production for the increase of access to it on the part of the majority. The second theme is the deepening of democracy, and in particular the creation of what I have called a high-energy democracy. The third theme now is the development of a civil society outside the state and outside the market that can build itself, albeit with the support of the state. And the fourth is the formation of the individual who is capable of turning the tables on his context as well as of acting within the context, and thus especially education. Now let's begin then with the theme of civil society. The basic idea, the intuition that stands at the source of this argument is that only an organized or a self-organized society can generate alternatives and act on them. And we can't suppose that the creation of this organized civil society or self-organized civil society is something that will happen automatically or naturally. It is thus a domain for action. And this in itself already introduces a puzzle, because when I say it's a domain for action, it seems to suggest that it's a creation of the government, of the state, which leads to the idea of a statist, a state-controlled, or a state-guided civil society. But therein lies the ambiguity, because the creation is by the law, and the law is not the same thing as the state. It's not the idea that civil society stands under the guard of the state, but it must have an institutional framework, and this institutional framework must be established in law, or in a kind of proto-law leading up to law. Now let me give you an example from our previous arguments about this. When we were discussing the labor law regimes of the 20th century, I pointed out that in addition to collective bargaining, the contractualist regime, there was in the 20th century a second alternative, the corporatist regime. The corporatist regime, which was initially inspired by Mussolini's Carta del Lavoro of 1927, but that was transposed to Latin America and used by the nationalist, leftist autocrats or semi-autocrats of Latin America, like Cardenas in Mexico, Perón in Argentina, and Vargas in Brazil. The corporatist labor law regime, I said, has two principles, which are the inverse of the principles underlying the contractualist regime. The first principle is that the union structure is that all workers are automatically unionized. Under the contractualist regime, unionization is the collective equivalent to freedom of contract, and the workers have to decide whether to unionize or not. In practice, this means that unionization is the labor of Sisyphus. They're always trying to unionize and trying to maintain the union. They can't count on its existence, but have to continually give it new life. Under the corporatist regime, unionization is a gift of the law. Everyone is automatically unionized, everyone who has a job in some part of the economy. And then there's a structure, a national structure of the unions, which is based primarily on functional or sectoral principles, what sector you're in, and secondarily on territorial principles, state federations, national federations, and so forth. The second principle of the corporatist labor law regime is that the unions are in principle a part of the state, and thus serve as a device of what the political scientists later came to call controlled popular mobilization. And the state acts typically through the intermediation of a ministry of labor. There is a charge automatically levied on the salaries of workers to finance this union structure, whether they want or not. And the state is guided, the unions are guided by the state as an auxiliary part of the state apparatus. Now, when we were discussing the problem of labor and capital, I suggested that for the organized part of the economy, the part that is unionized or was unionized, and that has stable jobs, a solution would be what I call the hybrid regime. The hybrid regime would take from the contractualist regime the principle of complete freedom of the unions from the state. The unions would not be part of the state, and they would not be shaped or guided by the Ministry of Labor. They would be entirely autonomous, and each union would be affiliated or not with rival ideologies, political parties, and movements. So, and these movements would compete for position in the unitary structure of the union system, just as under a democratic state, different political parties compete for position in the unitary structure of the democratic state. Now, under that hybrid regime, the unions are not subordinate to the state, but there is an organization of the unions created by the law, thus illustrating the point that I just made, that this idea presupposes that it has to be organized and embodied in law, but that doesn't make it an instrument of the state. That's the ambiguity. Now, this supposes that we think of labor law as not simply a part of private law. Under the contractualist regime, under the collective bargaining system, we think labor law is an extension of contract law. In the employment relation, there's radical inequality of bargaining power, resulting in economic duress. And the inequality of bargaining power is so great that the contractual form of the wage relationship risks becoming a facade behind which there lurks the reality of economic oppression, of economic necessity. The worker must work and accept his job. And in the interwar period, especially in Europe, this led to the idea that there would be a third body of law between private law and public law. And this idea was developed by the jurist and sociologist George Gurevitch in a then famous book written in French, which was never translated into English, unfortunately, but if you can read French, you can read it. It's called L'idée du droit social. And it's a study of this third system of law between private and public, and an illustration of the debates of that time. Then there were this, in Italy and in France, there were the schools of the so-called institutionalists. These institutionalists in general were close to a corporatist communitarianism. And the central theme was the theme of co-option or cooperation between capital and labor to restrain the free play of class interests. The capitalists, the owners of capital, would show self-restraint and cooperate with the workers. And the workers similarly, rather than simply resorting to violent industrial action, would cooperate with their employers. So in this way, the emphasis on social capital in the labor setting was given a conservative tilt. And that was also the tendency, the dominant tendency, as I observed in those earlier classes, of the social doctrines of the Catholic Church in the interwar period, especially as illustrated by the encyclical of Pius XI, Quadragesimo Anno, in 1931, called Quadragesimo Anno because it was disseminated on the 40th anniversary of Rerum Novarum of 1891, which is the foundation of the modern social teaching of the Catholic Church. And it had the same general direction of emphasizing consensus, cooperation, co-option among labor and capital. So that's the background, which has left a sour taste in the mouth of the liberals and leftists who see all these ideas of social law as having this corporatist conservative bias. Now I say that because in the argument that I'm about to develop, there is of course no such view. No bias toward the conservative. What remains is the conception that the construction of this institutional framework this framework of law between public and private is a legitimate and even a necessary task of us today. That civil society must be organized, and we cannot suppose that its organization or its self-organization will arise simply spontaneously. Now, what then is the theme, the underlying theme? It begins with the idea that I mentioned a moment ago, that only an organized society, an organized civil society, outside the market and outside the state, can generate alternatives and act on them. If society is entirely fragmented, if people just distrust one another, if there's no density of associational capital, the society is rendered by its disorganization impotent. And now let me again illustrate this idea, this general idea, by reference to a very important theme in contemporary politics, which I also discussed before, which is the theme of crime and the way in which society copes with violence. Now, I did mention in that earlier class that there are basically two types of crime: organized crime and common or episodic crime. There is no society in the world, even the society in which criminal gangs are the most highly organized, in which organized crime is the predominant form of crime. In every society in the world, even in these societies which are supposed to be under the shadow of criminal gangs, most crime is episodic crime. And the worldwide debate about crime is characteristically disfigured by a failure to understand the significance of this simple fact. Organized crime and episodic crime are radically different phenomena. Organized crime is an expression of the weakness of the state, the omission of the state, the absence of the state. And organized crime is a parallel state, and it typically flourishes by winning over and providing functions or tasks of the state. The mafia, for example, historically in Italy, took on responsibilities of the state and won a measure of popular acceptance by performing functions that were functions of the state. Therefore, in principle, the only solution to organized crime is the war of the state with the anti-state being organized crime. A war conducted, of course, selectively with intelligence on the basis of insight into the nature of this organized crime, but nevertheless a war. Episodic crime, I argue then, is a completely different phenomenon. Episodic crime is an expression of the disorganization of society rather than of the weakness of the state. And it can only be fundamentally resolved by contending with this disorganization of society. So even in countries that are very poor and where radical inequality abounds, the level of episodic crime at the grassroots, at the in local society, declines radically if the society is highly organized. And why is that? Think of it just intuitively. It's because organization implies transparency and implies responsibility. If the society is highly organized, even on the basis of organizations that we would have reason to distrust, like the caste organizations of Village India, organized crime will be much lower than it would otherwise be if these organizations are present and result in people feeling responsible for what happens around them. Their eyes are open, they see what's happening, and they feel it's about them, it's not just about someone else. So that's simply by way of suggesting the practical significance as well as the theoretical interest of this theme of the self-organization of civil society outside the state. Now, if civil society becomes more organized, if somehow we manage to provoke this self-organization, and ideally to provoke it not on the basis of antecedent organizations like the caste organizations or class-based organizations, but new organizations that perform new functions, like, for example, monitoring the distribution of public services. The benefits can be immense, because although the forms of association that we create may be initially motivated by the struggle against episodic crime, once they're there, they can serve a multiplicity of other functions as well. And those functions then provide real power to local society, to society at the grassroots level. Now think of the economy. And I would start with a generalization. And why is this self-organization of civil society economically important? A general principle would be that in the short term, economic growth is largely about opportunities for gainful investment in relation to the available stock of capital. And this relation of the available stock of capital to the opportunities for gainful investment is expressed and recorded in the rate of interest. That's what the rate of interest in principle is or should be when it is not manipulated simply to serve the interests of the financiers and of the banks. In the long term, economic growth depends on innovation, on institutional, organizational, technological, and conceptual innovation. But in the long, medium term, what is fundamental is the ability to cooperate. And thus, the importance of social capital, of associational density, of trust. So, for example, you could say that the most advanced forms of production, like the knowledge economy, by comparison to Fordist industry, to conventional industry, have as one of their characteristic attributes to raise the level of discretion and of mutual trust that is required and allowed of all participants in the process of production. So, for example, Fordist manufacturing, conventional industry, typically relies on a command and control form of organization, obedience, and hierarchy, and highly specialized jobs. By contrast, the more advanced forms of production depend on an elevation of the level of indispensable trust, and trust making possible wider discretion. So, take a simple, trivial example, the so-called Toyota method of production in post-Fordist manufacturing requires that there be teams, that these teams have wide discretion in the constant reinvention of the process of production. And so there has to be a higher level of trust. The high energy democracy, another major theme in the programmatic argument, doesn't require the substitution of the ordinary incarnate flesh and blood individual with private interest by this myth of the selfless citizen, but does require a gradual cumulative expansion of the horizon of his political attention and his political engagement. And thus many of the institutional changes for which I argue in the description of a high energy democracy would have this characteristic. So I'm simply suggesting by the accumulation of these examples the wide practical relevance of this theme. It's not enough to democratize the market and to deepen democracy and popular engagement in the affairs of the Republic. It's also necessary to motivate, to inspire the self-organization of civil society and the accumulation of social capital. They provide the indispensable atmosphere in which these political and economic innovations must breathe. That's the basic thesis now. Before I go any further, let me ask, would someone like to make a remark about this argument so far, or ask any questions? Yes.
I guess one thing that's coming up for me is I'm having trouble understanding the idea that the only solution to organized crime is war between the state and the anti-state. I'm specifically thinking of how, to me, that's like the war on drugs, and also doesn't that directly contradict the other idea that, you know, revolution or change should come out of trauma or conflict, but rather imagination? So how do we deal with those two truths?
I'm not quite understanding. Where are you locating the problem?
I guess the idea of like, how are you defining war between the state and the anti-state, or the state and organized crime? And then why is it specific?
Well, these criminal gangs have to be broken up, right? They have to be, they're defying the state. They're claiming to take on functions of the state, and they will proliferate in situations in which the state is complacent with its activity. So it's that complacency that has to be broken. And it's an abrupt breaking which requires conflict between the state and the anti-state. That's a simple proposition. There's no way out of it. So that's how it happens. And this is all by way of countering the supposition that there's a simple opposition of state and market. The market presupposes a world, as I said way earlier, a world of the generalization of a modicum of trust, low trust, among strangers. So I said, what is a market in simple sociological or cultural terms? It's a simplified form of cooperation, which is impossible where there is no trust, and unnecessary where there is high trust. It is based on low trust generalized among strangers, by opposition to one of the great themes of classical sociology, which was that in the pre-market or traditional societies, there was a radical distinction between the treatment of insiders and the treatment of outsiders. So everything to the insiders, nothing to the outsiders. The market society is a world in which you can rely, at least relatively, on the word of the stranger. The stranger can enter into a bilateral executory contract, which is an arm's length contract for the exchange of performances at some instantaneous moment in the future. That's the legal expression of this low trust economy. And then comes the organized crime and creates this anarchy at the grassroots of society, defying the state, taking over, presuming to take over some of the powers and responsibilities of the state. So then the state, even if it's a liberal state, a market state, has to respond. And it responds by what is in fact a war. Now the problem is that this leads to the simplification that that's the whole problem of crime. And I said, it's never the whole problem of crime, because there's no real society in which organized crime is responsible for the majority of criminal incidents. In every real society, the majority of criminal incidents are of the other kind of crime, the episodic crime. But episodic crime is a much more complicated phenomenon, because the struggle with the anti-state is at least relatively easy to imagine, but dealing with the consequences of the disorganization of civil society is a wholly different matter, much more difficult to deal with. And that may be one of the reasons why it does not normally become a topic of political discourse. The other form of crime is tangible, it's visible. The enemy can be pinpointed. But for episodic crime, the enemy is diffuse. The enemy is this disorganization of civil society. That's the basic argument. Now, let me go on then to the second stage of the discussion, which is also being anticipated, and give you two examples. So, most ways of providing organization for society rely on antecedent group identities or forms of social organization. I just gave the example of India and the caste organizations. And in principle, we would say, in this kind of an argument that I've been developing, that the better kind, the more profound associational dense connection arises from purpose-driven organizations created by people from different walks of life. Does not rely on the antecedent hierarchical or divided structure of society, but creates new forms of association based on common purpose. There are then two questions that arise in relation to this discussion of social capital. The first question is, should we treat social capital, associational density, the level of trust, as a constant or as a variable? Is it simply a feature of a culture, the culture of a country, of a society, that we cannot propose or pretend to modify? Or is it something that we can reshape? And I definitely want to argue that we can reshape it. That it is not just an aspect of the fate of a society. And then the second question is, of course, what is the path by which we would reshape it if we accept this proposition that we can reshape it and that it's not just a fate. And in response to that second question, I then want to give some examples. All of which I previously mentioned in one setting or another. So the first example is the way of providing public services, which after all is one of the great themes of electoral politics in every democracy in the world. The efficiency, the quality, the sufficiency of public services as they are currently provided. And I observe that in general in the world, all we have by way of the provision of public services is what we would call administrative Fordism. By analogy to economic Fordism, Fordist mass production. Administrative Fordism meaning that the dominant way in the world of providing public services is the provision of standardized, low-quality services by the bureaucratic apparatus of the state. And when I say low-quality services, I mean simply services of lower quality than the comparable services that could be bought with money, who could be bought by someone who has money on the market. That's administrative Fordism. So there's now a post-Fordist form of production, but there's no post-Fordist form of administration. There's no administrative equivalent to the knowledge economy. And the only alternative to this administrative Fordism seems to be the privatization of public services in favor of profit-driven firms. That's the particular conundrum. So what would be an alternative? And I then described in broad outline the possible direction of such an alternative. Again, not a blueprint, but a direction, a pathway. So you would say in this alternative, the state in these contemporary societies is responsible for providing a universal minimum of basic services to everyone. So there must be a universally mandated public option in the provision of public services. And that's what you could call the floor, the administrative floor. And similarly, you might say the state might be responsible for operating at the ceiling, at the frontier, in the development of the most complex and innovative and costly public services. But in the broad middle zone between the floor and the ceiling, the state would partner with independent civil society in the competitive, pluralistic, and experimental provision of public services. So there would be cooperatives of health professionals, of education professionals, proposing to cooperate with the state in the provision of public services. The state would help finance them. The state would help train them to the extent that their previous professional training was insufficient for the discharge of this responsibility. The state would monitor them, but the actual implementation would be carried out by these third sector cooperatives, these forms of social organization. And society then would begin to organize itself, or it would heighten the level of its self-organization, motivated by this task of creating the services that it needs. So it's as if you were to say, the creation of the future civil society is the real object of this activity. The provision of public services is the way in which the present civil society creates or co-creates the future civil society. And it does so not just by ideologies or national politics or partisan politics, but by participating actively and experimentally in the provision of public services. So that would be an example of a way in which we wouldn't simply rely for the self-organization of civil society on antecedent organizations created around so-called ascriptive identities, that is, identities defined by membership in groups created at birth, like racial or religious or whatever. But we would create these purpose-driven associations among people for whom the major cement is ideas, opinions, and professional capabilities. A second example of the deliberate formation of associational connections is the idea of national service. In particular, by analogy or by extension from military service. So in principle, in a republic, the citizens have the responsibility to defend the state. All the peoples of the world are divided into nation states under the shield of these armed sovereign states. So let's remember, we're going to discuss next week, globalization. We pay a terrible price for this division of humanity into separate states. The terrible price is the risk of war. But if the states were not divided, if we didn't have different peoples living in different states under the shield of these armed states, we couldn't do what is indispensable which is to develop the powers and possibilities of humanity in different directions. The powers and possibilities of humanity can develop only in different directions, and thus the need for the state. But the states, if we didn't have that, we just have cultural differences, would be like folklore. You know, the Italians are different from the French, they have different habits, different etiquette. It would be a fluff. It's only when they're embodied in institutions, in distinct institutional arrangements, that they're for real, and that these differences can be deep-cutting. If there were an empire, there would be an evolution toward a common set of arrangements with different habits or tics in different parts of the empire. But we couldn't count on the reality and the depth of these differences. So let's not fool ourselves. There's a terrible price to pay for this. And the price that could even lead to the extinction of humanity. But we must pay that price, I would argue, because at least in the present stage of our ascent, there's no alternative to it. So the citizens must defend the Republic. And the army, writ large, that is, the armed forces, must never be just a mercenary force paid by one part of the country, then paid by the rest of the country to defend them, like an army of poor people to fight the wars of rich people. The army must be, in a republic, the nation in arms, and it can be nothing else. So whenever a so-called purely confessional army is accepted by the citizens, that is quite clearly, to my mind, a form of corruption of the republic, which then allows the asset-holding class to exempt itself from paying the most terrible price, which is the price of risking death in the defense of the republic. So we could say, as the occasion for the formation of national service, that at least in large countries, typically, we don't need all the members of the age cohort to be soldiers for a time, in the men and women. And those who are exempt then from the compulsory military service could be subject to a compulsory social service according to their educational direction, their professional direction. They go serve the country, ideally in some part of the country different from the part of the country in which they live. And thus they collaborate with the members of different classes. They help build the country, they build the nation and its future through this association with others. And in this national service, they receive rudimentary military training so they can compose a reserve force that can be mobilized in case of national emergency. And that is because in the reality of war among states, there's no technological war. There's no war that at some stage does not involve the massive movement of people, soldiers on the ground. The other thing, the idea that war can just be at a distance, a war of gadgets, of technological instruments, is a fantasy. It's not the reality of war, because even when destruction is wrought by the technologies, there has to be the second stage of occupation and confrontation. And without that, it's not real. But we can imagine that this national service is not just performed in one moment in life, but might be, for example, a recurrent event in the lifetime of an individual, which would take different forms later on as he ascends or she ascends in his or her professional career. National service is very important in these societies, so that the market economy not become a market society in which the attitudes to social responsibility is always considered an afterthought, or something that you can pay not to do. So there you have two examples of the principle, the higher principles of association. The alternative way of providing public services, and the institution of the principle of national service. Your comments? Yes.
You talked a bit about public-private partnerships, and made me think of a government contractor state, specifically the military-industrial complex. And I wonder what your take is on that as a model for this type of cooperation you're talking about between the state and what currently exists, starting with what is right now, which is the market, and using that to kind of build out this.
We'll say a little bit more so I understand the full context of what you're meaning about.
Yeah, you talked about the government partnering with this civic society and giving
For the provision of public services. Yeah.
Right. And because that doesn't exist right now, what it made me think of was like the military-industrial complex and the government contractor state, and governments partnering with the market economy to produce these goods. Do you see that as a viable first step?
What that suggests to me is the example of the war economy, which I may have mentioned. The Second World War is a remarkable experience that the Americans had, because the whole world thought they were supposedly devoted to these sacrosanct market principles. And when necessity hit at the door, they discarded their devotion to the market dogmas as if it were just a mask. And they had never really believed in it completely. So the whole economy was run as a free-floating collaboration between the state, the federal government, and the large businesses in the country. But Congress tried to get the small businesses into the act, but that didn't really work at that time through the Small Businesses War Act. It was basically large business. And as I think I mentioned, the redistributive tax, the income tax, reached a confiscatory proportion. The highest rate of the personal and progressive income tax was over 90% in the Second World War. And it's an extraordinary event, which had sensational outcome, because in 4 years, the GDP of the United States more than doubled. There's never been, in all of American history, such an example of economic growth. But unfortunately, the experiment of the war economy was treated as an anomaly, completely dependent on the unique conditions of war in which the state guaranteed both the demand and the supply. guarantee the supply by commandeering the whole productive apparatus of the country and determining the priorities of production, and it commandeered the demand by buying everything that was produced. So a basic reason why the Americans won the war is their quantitative exuberance. They simply produced everything. They outproduced everyone else, numerically. And that's, in a way, an example of this. So that could lead to the idea, which I take very seriously, but which is not discussed in the United States, of a war economy without a war. Because the war economy contained within itself the two main principles of a fundamental transformation, which are massive mobilization of physical, financial, and human resources, and radical institutional experimentalism. But the second element of the radical institutional experimentalism remained inchoate, not codified, not institutionalized, and treated as this extraordinary exception for the conditions of war. And another point that this illustrates is the strength of the United States. The United States has been successful because of the strength of the ability to cooperate. And in this respect, even its defects have been useful. So, for example, the Americans were disinclined to accept the reality of class in their country. And to suppose that it was the free-floating atoms that rise and fall in the medium that Herbert Hoover described. But paradoxically, this blindness to the reality of class seemed to have helped them cooperate with one another when they needed. And that was another reason why they won the war. So this is all part of the background in which a society has more capabilities than it manifests. So who would have thought that they could have done this, but they did it. And I think that in that story, the ability to cooperate was fundamental. To cooperate across racial lines, across class lines, in the face of an emergency. And that's what we should be able to count on in non-war situations. And in a way, these proposals that I mentioned, like the alternatives of providing public services and the principle of national service, are ways of playing on that idea, of developing that potential. So this is one of the great unexplored themes in contemporary social and political thought. This theme of trust, of cooperation. In the 20th century, as I said, it took the form, this biased form, which we have reason to distrust, of corporatist communitarianism. And I'm trying to show that it can take many other forms, and that those other forms are in fact necessary ingredients for the development of these alternatives. So there are American political scientists like Robert Putnam here at Harvard who have developed this theme of social solidarity, of association. It's a theme in which the influence of Christianity remains great. Many of the people who have developed this idea in the social sciences are Catholics, because still the background of the teachings of the church, although biased in the way I described. Any other reflections on this? This is a wonderful subject because I think that we always think that a movement has to be either economic or political, but a movement can be also social. It can begin outside the market, outside the sphere of politics, narrowly conceived, and then penetrate the political and the economic. Any other remark, any intervention? Now, so the other subject for today is education, the formation of the agent. And this too is a wonderful subject, mysterious, philosophical, transcendent significance. And a good place to begin is to remember Plato's view. Plato's view in the Republic was that the reform of education must begin in an initial act of violence, which is the child must be taken out of its family. Family is the overwhelming influence. And this view of Plato's, this proposal of his, reminds me of one of the most penetrating reflections, comments that was ever made about the philosophers. Robert Musil, modernist Austrian writer, the author of The Man Without Qualities, said, philosophers are despots without armies. And an example of this, Plato's theme. So of course what's the problem with this Platonic proposal? The problem is that, yes, the family provides all this distortion, this influence. But the family is the natural setting of the incarnate human being who needs love and recognition. He's not going to get love from the preceptors of the state who are interested in his service to this distant ideal. He has flesh and bones, a human reality, quivering flesh that needs to be cradled and sustained, loved. The natural reality of a human being whose power of transcendence is inseparable from his finitude, from his incarnate human reality. And this is what was denied in Plato's proposal. So the problem is the role of the school in a democracy. My view, which in this respect is like Plato's view, is that the state in a democracy must be the voice of the future. And of course, the state, no, the school in a democracy must be the voice of the future. But of course, the future doesn't exist any more than the past. The only thing that exists is the present. Now, the augmented present in which we all live, the present which is about to become something else. And there are three powers that contend for influence on the school. The first power is the family. The family says to the child, become like me. Even if it has dreams of worldly success and ascent, the child, it wants proximity, it wants its influence, its religion, its beliefs to be stamped on the child. It's the ideology of the amoeba. Today, cellular division, tomorrow the world. The second influence on the school is the state. The state wants to be served. It wants citizens, it wants soldiers that serve its interests, defend its power. And the third influence on the school is the university, or the intellectual elite. The university has a particular canonical view of knowledge, of culture, and as I've said before here, most countries in the world have national curriculums, and these national curriculums are like infantilizations of the orthodoxies of the university culture. That is, they translate into the language of children what the university thinks the world is like. And the orthodoxies of the university culture are full of false presuppositions. It has two salient characteristics. One is the forced marriage of methods and subject matters. Economics is not the study of the economy. Economics is the study of a method invented by the marginalist theoreticians at the end of the 19th century. Any study of the economy by some other method is not regarded as economics. On the other hand, the application of that method to subjects that seem to have nothing to do with the realities of production and exchange is regarded as economics. Evolutionary biology is studied by a historical method. Fundamental physics is studied by an anti-historical method which affirms the primacy of structure over history. Even though we discovered in the 1920s that the universe has a history, and therefore every part of the natural world must be historical. So part of the education of an educated person should be to dissolve these forced marriages between methods and subject matters, and to imagine the study of the subject matters by some other method, which the university culture does not accommodate. A second characteristic of the university culture is the suppression of the philosophical element, of the implicit ontology, the assumptions about the way the world, what the world is like, in the study of each discipline. So in every science, even the science most revered, like fundamental physics, there is no simple narration of what science has discovered. There's always an implicit ontology, a picture of the kinds of things that there are, particles and fields, for example, in physics, as opposed to the world forces and objects in Newtonian mechanics. Once this philosophical element is exposed, you begin to become aware that the same empirical discoveries could be described in a different way if they were combined with different ontologies. So it has a similar effect to the effect of the dissolution of the forced marriage between methods and subject matter. The real subject of education in these class societies that exist in the world is not just the mastery of this conventional body of knowledge, but also the acquisition of a particular style of sociability. So in the United States, for example, there's an educational dualism, a division between the mass of public schools and the elite public schools and the elite private schools. And one of the fundamental topics of education in the elite public and private schools is the acquisition of this particular style of sociability. The individual student must be charismatic and seductive and cast a halo of suppressed charisma and seduction over his fellows, but at the same time conceal it in this self-concealing aura, because that's regarded as useful or indispensable to participation in the American professional and business class. Education is about freedom. So education has to be against all of this, against the forced methods of the forced marriage of method and subject matter, against the hiding of the philosophical element in our supposedly empirical discoveries, against these paradigms of sociability which the school teaches us to imitate and so forth. Liberation. And liberation from the contemporary experience and idea is the subject of education, is the real subject of education. Now then the question is, what's the educational project that goes together with an inclusive knowledge economy, a knowledge economy for the many, a high energy democracy, and a self-organized civil society, outside the market and outside the state. So in countries that are large, unequal, and especially federal in structure, like the United States, there's first a practical imperative to reconcile the local management of the schools by the states and municipalities with national standards of investment and quality. The principle must be that the quality of the education that a young person receives must not depend on the happenstance of where he or she was born, or to whom he or she was born. And to reconcile national standards of investment and quality with local management, 3 instruments are necessary. First, there has to be intensive evaluation of the results of the diverse ways of doing things. And of course, the difficulty is that the tests record a small subset of the qualities that we would have The second is there has to be a mechanism of redistribution of resources and staff from richer places to poor places. It's intolerable that the school system should, for example, depend on local finance. And the third is there has to be a procedure for corrective intervention when, despite all efforts, a local school system repeatedly fails to achieve the threshold of quality and of investment. There has to be some procedure to take it over, to fix it. Not necessarily a federal intervention, but some trans-federal mechanism of collaboration among the three levels of the Federation that makes it possible to take over local finances, to delegate its administration for a while to its reformers, the professional reformers, and to return it fixed. So what is the content? And we can see the content with respect to general education and with respect to professionally, to technical or practical education. The old European system was general education for the elites and technical or practical education for the masses. And that's not acceptable, but there still has to be a division between bookish education and education which allows us to acquire practical capabilities. So focusing first on theoretical education, what should its attributes be in this kind of a society? The first is that the emphasis, the theme should be on the understanding of transformation. How do things change in nature and in society? Because it's only by insight into how things change that we understand anything. So transformative insight should be the fundamental principle of attention. How do things change? What leads one thing to become another thing? Given that the world, the universe as a whole, is a world in which everything changes sooner or later, including change itself. The analytic and synthetic capabilities of the imagination must be subservient to this principle of insight into transformation. And behind this stands an idea of the imagination. The imagination is having two decisive moves. One move is distancing from the phenomenon. This is the move that Kant emphasized. An image, the topic of the imagination, is the memory of a perception. To imagine it, you can't be in front of it. You have to distance yourself from it. But the second move is the fundamental one. The second move is the subsumption of the actual phenomenon under a periphery of imagined transformation. Imagining what it could become given certain interventions or certain changes in its environment. The theirs to which we can get from here. That's how we understand anything, in nature or in society. If we don't understand it transformatively, we don't understand it, period. We just stare at it. And then all we have by way of insight is retrospective rationalization, what we call in the history of philosophy, right-wing Hegelianism. The real is rational. Transformative insight as the guide The second principle is this. We don't acquire these capabilities necessary to transformative insight without dealing with content. We have to deal with content. But with content, what matters is depth, selective depth, not encyclopedic superficiality, selective deepening. Therefore, education should be thematic or project-oriented and not encyclopedic. No encyclopedic superficiality. Because what matters is to equip the mind with this ability to imagine transformatively both the natural and the social phenomena. The third principle is to give a new meaning to the idea of classical education. So the idea of classical education is the idea that you study not just the vision, the experience of your own society and culture now, but you have a third eye. You study also another society, another culture, in principle a culture that has some kind of genealogical relationship to your own, so that it's distant from now, but at the same time it's connected to now. And in world history there are two main examples of this. One is the study of Greco-Roman antiquity by the Europeans. And the second example was the study of the Confucianist canon or classics by the Mandarins of the Chinese Empire. So of course, what's unacceptable in this idea of classical education is the narrowness of the canon. The Greco-Roman canon, the Confucianist canon. The canon has to be radically diversified. But what is valuable is this idea of a double vision. You have the vision of the present, but you have another vision. So that you're able to see with this other eye and to distance yourself from your time, without which no one is educated. No one is educated who is at the mercy of the presuppositions and biases of his present setting. The fourth principle of this general education should be that it should be cooperative. Cooperation is the method of advanced science. And it should be brought forward to the earliest stages of schooling. Cooperation among students, between students and teachers, among schools, combining in presence and distance and so forth. All forms of cooperation. And cooperation is the alternative to the combination, to the juxtaposition of individualism and authoritarianism, which is the characteristic of most schooling in the world. The fifth principle of education is the most difficult to achieve. And that is that all education should be dialectical. Nothing should be taught just once. Everything should be taught at least twice from opposing points of view. Once we abandon the encyclopedic bias, we have time. We don't have to spend our time studying details of this or that. We can study a few things, but study them comprehensively and from opposing points of view. The dialectical method is the only way to equip and liberate the mind. There is no other way. And it's the only way to subvert the hold of shallow orthodoxy over the mind. So that's a description of a particular path in education. Now, how, in the large countries of the contemporary world, how could such a project be instituted? It can't be instituted by a philosopher or an educational despot at the center of power. It has to be a national movement with hundreds of schools, thousands of teachers. And individuals can have an important role in the inspiration of such a movement. If you just take the New World, the Western Hemisphere, we've seen that repeatedly. Sarmiento in Argentina, José Vasconcelos in Mexico, and John Dewey in the United States, even though John Dewey was never in power. But whatever exists by way of progressive education in the United States, in this distorted top tier of the school system, can be attributed to Dewey. So if you see what happened to Dewey and to Dewey's program, it's a characteristic example of what happened to these programs in the world. So the part that was accepted was the part about cooperative analytical problem solving in the elite tier of the school system in the United States. That's the Deweyan program. The part that was rejected was the part about the criticism of established ideas and institutions. So no criticism, but analytical, cooperative problem solving. Instead of the critical part, they put in the acquisition of that approved style of sociability to which I referred a moment ago. But there's no alternative to trying to have a national movement. And these are movements really of liberation of countries. That they liberate the collective genius through these reforms of education. And that in turn inspires everything else. The political project, the economic project, and so forth. So this should, the question is there an equivalent in practical or technical education to this program in general education? And I think there is. So in the world now, the main paradigm of practical education, by far the most influential, is the old German model of practical education, which is oriented to job-specific and machine-specific skills. So you learn the different professions. To be a plumber, to be an electrician, you master the 5 kinds of machine-cutting lathes, and so forth. And now, of course, there has to be something completely different. Practical education has to be focused on the higher order practical and conceptual capabilities required not just for the use, but for the reprogramming of numerically controlled machine tools. So in that world, there's an approximation between practical education and theoretical education of the kind I just described. They're on the continuum. They're not radically opposed. And the cognitive psychologists like Piaget of the 20th century emphasized the intimate relation between the development of our practical capabilities and the development of our conceptual capabilities. And with this laid the theoretical basis for this alliance that I'm describing between the reformed general education and the reformed practical education. So this, all of this, of course, is way outside the field of traditional party politics, because this isn't about institutional change or change in policy. It's about changing consciousness. And the creation of the agent who is able to act not only within his context, but against the context, to turn the tables on the context. And the idea, yes, the crucial assumption is the capability within the context is inseparable from capability to transform the context. So all of this, so what connects then these remarks about the change of culture and consciousness and education to the institutional debates that we've been having in the course? And once again, explain it by a conceptual picture recurring to an idea, an image that I proposed earlier. There are moves that we make within a context, a framework of arrangements and assumptions that we take for granted. Those are the routine moves of the agent, of the society, of the mind. And there are the exceptional moves by which, from time to time, typically under the pressure of crisis, of social crisis or existential crisis, we challenge and change pieces of the framework. And what do we want? To be free, to be empowered. What we want is to narrow the distance between these two classes of moves, so that the moves by which we change and challenge parts of the framework grow more naturally and organically out of the moves, the ordinary business of life, the moves that we make within the framework. And then we're freer, we're greater, and we ascend as the progressives must want to a higher form of life with more intensity, with more capability, with more scope, provided that we ascend together. And that's what connects this debate about consciousness to the institutional debates. Now, what do you think? I think every country in the world is in principle open to this kind of militancy, to this kind of inspiration, even though the practical role of the individuals who will do this is not evident. It's not apparent. But I think that it's the combination of efforts and proposals of structural change, these changes in consciousness and in the empowerment of the individual, which has this extraordinary potential, incendiary potential, transformative potential. Even though it's very hard for us to visualize the immediate practical forms that such action would take. So let me hear what you think of this. So what about this project of educational reform that I described? Yes.
I wonder what you think about the efforts to make education more practical in the U.S. and how it's kind of made education shittier, and especially at like universities where social sciences have been co-opted by corporations. They don't think about how to make a better human life, for example. They think about how to market it to more people. Just as a
Yeah, but I don't think we should have some overall bias against practical. So, for example, take legal education. Here we are sitting in a law school. It's a very interesting subject. all over the world, the characteristic defect of legal education is that it's neither theoretical nor practical. Most legal education in the whole world is a kind of doctrinal scholasticism. So, at Harvard Law School, for example, at these elite American law schools, the topic of legal education is the acquisition of a particular style of argument and analysis. It's not learning the law, the content of the law. The content of the law, the students learn at the end of the 3-year course, cramming for the bar review examination in a few months. The whole time in law school is spent in the acquisition of this way of speaking, of analyzing, of arguing. It's much more like learning to play the piano than it is like studying Euclid's geometry. And then the students are indebted, so they're in debt slavery, and that's one of the reasons why they feel required to go to these law firms to pay off their debts. And the second thing is they feel correctly that they don't know how to do anything. So they have to go to law firms for the second reason, which is to learn how to do things. So in my view, in that situation, theory and practice are not the opposite. Theory and practice should be an alliance. They should be taught how to do things so that they don't need to go to law firms to know how to do things. And they should also have a theoretical education about it, because the law is, as I said at the outset of the course, our ideas and interests are always nailed to the cross of the institutions and arrangements that represent them in fact. And the law is the site of this crucifixion. That's what the law is. It's not about judges and cases and courts. It's about these institutional arrangements. The stuff about courts and so forth is secondary. It's an accessory part. So it seems to me that, and now they could study the globalized world. You can't study the rules and laws of all the countries in the world, but there's a very restricted menu of live options in the world, the basic setups, and that's the real content of comparative and international law. So it seems to me that a legal education could be very practical and much more theoretical at the same time. And they would both, the theoretical component and the practical component would both have as their antagonist this doctrinal scholasticism, this rhetorical scholasticism, which at the moment is the main subject of study. Yes?
In law school, we're talking about education generally, people who are in law school have self-selected to do something very specific. Could you maybe give an example of like what an 11th grade curriculum would look like that would match this to?
Which curriculum?
Like secondary school?
Well, I spoke about it. I think that I would like basic education to be deeper than university education. So I think my view is, under the present system, given the attempt to impose on the young the orthodoxies of the national, of the university culture, the young are emasculated, and they are delivered to the universities prepared for a life of intellectual servility. I would like it to be the opposite. I would like the university education to immunize them against this intellectual servility by the methods that I described, so that they arrive at the university already resistant to the orthodoxies of the university culture. And they arrive at these elite law schools already mobilized against and not taken in by the doctrinal scholasticism. That's not fun. And I think this all seems very high flow and very unrealistic and radical. But it's really, it's just an evolution of the most powerful idea in the world now, which is the enhancement of agency. The enhanced agent who turns the tables on his context, who is capable of acting within the context because he's capable of acting against the context. I know it seems to be a huge distance between all of that and the reality of the individual agent facing these institutions. But I think that, Goethe said the perspective of the observer is always conducive to fatalism and to irony. Because if you look at the situation from a distance, it always seems insuperable, like a wall. If you come close and you begin to act, you discover that it's full of contradictions. And that was the experience I've had of all of these places. So that leads to this thought that hope is not the cause of action. Hope is the consequence of action. There are all sorts of reasons why we act out of ambition, out of stupidity, out of indignation, out of anger. But once you act, through action you can become hopeful, because in action you discover that reality is not as monolithically opposed to the transformative will as it appears to be from afar. It's full of these contradictions. It's full of transformative opportunity. So that's not a very practical advice for about some particular plan of action, but that's the attitude that I would recommend. A hopeful and patient availability as the companion of transformative insight. And that's the spirit. And it's connected to the stuff that we've been discussing in the course, because this is something I mentioned in the first class of the course. Many countries in the world are governed by these ex-Marxists, ex-revolutionaries, who are this disenchanted, institutionally conservative social democrats. So the way they think, or what they tell themselves is this: real change would be the substitution of capitalism by socialism. Would be a revolutionary change. But that's not in the cards. And if it were in the cards, it would be too dangerous. So what's left to do? What's left to do is to humanize the world through compensatory redistribution, through the combination of class with meritocracy, and so on and so forth. So it's a sugarcoating, which is then succeeds to the impossible binary idea of politics. Politics, on this view, is either reformist, it's either a reformist management of the system, ameliorating its extreme defects, or it is the revolutionary substitution of one system by another. Since the revolutionary substitution is inaccessible, what's left to do is reformism. And that's then this view. So that's the view that has to be combated. And it can't be combated just by political ideas. It has to be combated by a different set of ideas about our moral psychology, what we were discussing a moment ago. Like, what's the proper role of hope? And what is its relation to fatalism and so forth? And so again, in the spirit of Marx's thesis on Feuerbach, solution is an action, not just practical action, but intellectual action. And anyone who acts is likely to become hopeful, I think. On the other hand, I've also reminded you of Hegel's principle that philosophy is revolutionary, even when it appears to be reactionary. Because once you try to form a general view of your situation, as we're trying to do here, in a way about the political and social situation, regardless of whether it's mistaken or in some ways conservative, viewing it as a whole arouses the idea of the possibility of reimagining it, of replacing it. And this all goes back to the other theme that I mentioned at the beginning of the course of world revolution. So here we are. Humanity has been living through this revolutionary period for like 300 years. And now, I think of myself, and my life happens to have fallen in a counter-revolutionary interlude in this long revolutionary period of the history of humanity. I want to think of it as an interlude because I want the revolution to continue. I know that to continue, it can continue only in a different form. It can't look like the Russian Revolution, the French Revolution, any of that stuff. It has to look completely different, has to have a different content, a different programmatic content, a different method, but it has to continue. And I don't want my ideas and actions to be shaped by the biases of the counter-revolutionary interlude. And then there's the problem. So in War and Peace, Pierre Bezuhoff looks at the sky, there's Halley's Comet. Halley's Comet is the presage of the invasion of Napoleon. There'll be always some exogenous crisis which will knock us out of our routine, lift us out. And like a war, a real war. And then things will change, and we'll have an opportunity to win our freedom. And now, what happens if our lives, so Halley's Comet comes every 90 so many years to the sky. What happens to if our lives happen to have fallen in between the visitations of Halley's Comet? We can't depend on the comet. So we need to take matters in our own hands and find a substitute for the comet. That's the other complication. Those are some of the attitudes that I bring to this discussion. I'm just trying to be straightforward about it, explicit about it. Well, next week, we'll continue this severe discussion, the discussion of globalization. Sobering, but hopeful. That's